Iran says it would respond ferociously to any U.S. attack, even limited strikes. China urges U.S. to lift unilateral tariffs on trading partners, saying there are no winners in trade war. And Chad closes several border crossings with Sudan over fears of spillover RSF attacks. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live, only on CGTN with me, Mahia Mutua in Nairobi. Uche Okoronko joins me now with your business headlines.
Thank you, Mahia. And here is a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. Planned legal action by Ethiopia's bondholders it threatens its debt restructuring process. And Ghana and Burkina Faso reach agreements to secure trade and border security. Of course, all of that coming up within the program. For now, it is back to you, Mahia.
All right, Uche, thank you. We begin with the latest on American tariffs, where China has urged the United States to lift its unilateral tariffs on trading partners, saying there are no winners in a trade war and protectionism leads nowhere. China's Commerce Ministry made the comments in response to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling declaring the Trump administration's tariffs illegal. Beijing says it's now conducting a comprehensive assessment of the court's decision and its implications. The U.S.'s unilateral measures violate international economic and trade rules and its own domestic laws. Facts have proven that China and the U.S. stand to gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation. Well, the United States says none of the countries it has reached trade deals with have said they plan to withdraw days after the Supreme Court struck down Trump's sweeping tariffs. Trade Representative Jameson Greer says the U.S. expects nations to comply with the deals. Trump has now imposed new tariffs of 15%. Edis Tiansen reports now from Los Angeles.
Financial markets reacted positively this week after the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump's sweeping tariff measures were unlawful. At the Port of Long Beach, importers and logistics firms are expressing cautious optimism, welcoming the pause in higher duties while bracing for possible policy shifts ahead.
Oh, you don't know how happy we are, and also the Cambodian people. You know that it's a lot of garments that export from Cambodia to United States. And tariff is hitting hard. But like you said, if a tariff's canceled, I hope it's true, that is going to make Cambodian people very happy back home.
Over 1,000 companies are already exploring legal ways to claim their refund from the total of nearly $200 billion paid in tariffs. The path forward may be challenging. President Trump criticized the Supreme Court's ruling while announcing a new tariff set to take effect this week, a move that could prolong uncertainty for businesses and global trading partners.
When these tariffs get relaxed, with the threat of maybe more tariffs coming down the road, the thing that I can guarantee is people start to bring a lot of goods into the country, which creates an immediate surge in demand. That import surge could result in short-term congestion and capacity crunches at major gateway ports like Long Beach and Los Angeles. Experts say inflationary pressure doesn't immediately reverse when duties are eliminated, and with global trade remaining unsettled, consumer prices may stay elevated for months.
American companies have created higher margin, higher profits, but that doesn't mean that prices are more competitive or they're going to go down. In fact, I think you're going to continue to see prices increase.
What's clear here at the Port of Long Beach is that every major player, importers, carriers, trucking firms, now faces a new layer of uncertainty. The Supreme Court's decision has undercut a core pillar of the administration's trade policy, while the president pivots buys time but doesn't fully answer many of the legal or economic questions companies are asking. It is Tianshan, CGTN, Port of Long Beach.
Meanwhile, the European Commission has demanded the U.S. stick to the terms of a trade deal reached last year. The Commission has criticized Trump's shifts in tariff policy and has demanded clarity from Washington. Chair of the European Parliament's Committee on International Trade, Bernd Lange, has urged a halt on legislative work pending the conclusion of trade negotiations with the United States. Elsewhere, Iran warns it will respond ferociously to any U.S. attack after President Donald Trump said he was considering limited strikes against the country. The U.S. has built up forces in the Middle East to pressure Iran ahead of talks set to resume Thursday in Geneva. Former CIA officer John Kiriakou, citing White House sources, told podcaster Julian Dorey a strike could come Monday or Tuesday. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian says talks have yielded encouraging signals, but Iran is prepared for any scenario. Ehsan Kevani has the latest now from Tehran.
Tensions between Iran and the United States have escalated sharply in recent weeks. The expanded presence of U.S. military forces in the region has intensified concerns over a potential military confrontation between Tehran and Washington. Meanwhile, the outcome of 2 rounds of negotiations, one held in Muscat, the capital of Oman, and the other in Geneva, remains uncertain. Iran has described the talks as constructive, but Washington appears to be pressing for greater concessions from Tehran. Here is what Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said at his latest press briefing.
We can only accept a concession or agreement that safeguards Iran's national interests and rights, both in the context of the nuclear issue and the removal of sanctions.
Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian says the recent negotiations involved an exchange of practical proposals and were accompanied by what he described as encouraging signals. U.S. President Donald Trump has warned that really bad things would follow if no agreement is reached on Tehran's nuclear program. In response, President Pezeshkian says Iran will continue to closely monitor U.S. actions. Tehran adds that it has put in place all necessary measures to respond to any possible scenario.
I think there is no limited strike. An act of aggression would be regarded as an act of aggression, period. And any state would react to an act of aggression as part of its inherent right of self-defense ferociously.
Many observers around the world and within Iran itself believe the February 26 negotiations in Geneva could represent the final opportunity for both sides to achieve a peaceful resolution and avert a catastrophic conflict. Iranian officials warn that any such war would have far-reaching consequences with repercussions felt across the entire region. Ehsan Kevani, CGTN, Tehran.
Mexico's most wanted drug lord has been killed in a targeted military raid. Nemesio Oseguera, known as El Mencho, was fatally wounded on Sunday in western Jalisco state. He died as he was being airlifted to Mexico City. The Mexican Defense Ministry says U.S. authorities provided intelligence. The drug raid triggered violence by organized crime groups in parts of the country. President Claudia Sheinbaum praised security forces and called on citizens to stay calm and well-informed. Frank Contreras has more now from Mexico City.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum and her security cabinet are confirming the death of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, also known as El Mencho, in Sunday's military operation to capture him. Oseguera Cervantes was the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a drug trafficking organization widely considered the most violent in Mexico. On Sunday, armed men burned vehicles in an attempt to block major highways and roads in several Mexican states, including Jalisco, Guanajuato, Michoacán, Puebla, Nayarit, Tamaulipas, and Veracruz. The governments of Canada and the United States are urging their citizens living in affected parts of Mexico to avoid going outside until further notice. Mexican government officials say highways are reopened and functioning in affected parts of the country. And Mexico's Secretary of Marine says the Pacific Coast port of Manzanillo, which receives goods around the clock from Asia, is operating normally. The United States Drug Enforcement Agency and the Mexican government said the New Generation Cartel of Jalisco was responsible for illegally transporting large quantities of heroin. cocaine, methamphetamines, and fentanyl to the United States. The death of the top leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel sends a powerful message to U.S. President Donald Trump that Mexico is taking major steps to dismantle drug trafficking organizations. But leading security analysts here expect more violence in the coming days as an internal battle ensues for control of this cartel, whose illegal drug trafficking routes are valued in the billions of dollars. Frank Contreras, CGTN, Mexico City.
Over to the Sudan conflict, and Chad has announced the closure of its border with Sudan over fears the fighting might spread into the country. Local officials said this includes the Adre crossing, a key route for aid entering Western Sudan. It comes amid intensified fighting between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces in parts of North and West Darfur. Chadian media reported on Saturday that RSF fighters had attacked a Chadian army camp in the border town of Tain, causing several casualties and destroying military vehicles. Chadian authorities have not officially commented on the reports. Traders in the Darfur city of El Geneina say the closure of the Adre crossing is affecting their operations. The RSF has faced repeated accusations of using the corridor to transport weapons and military equipment, a charge the group has denied. Well, we earlier spoke to Dr. Hassan Kanenje, director at the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. He started by explaining the implications of the fighting getting closer to Sudan's border with Chad and what that means for the region.
I think the escalation that has seen the closure of the border by Chad speaks to a number of things, and it has a number of implications. One, it risks drawing Chad into the conflict theater of Sudan, especially in trying to counter the attacks coming from RSF. The second thing is the humanitarian situation is at risk of actually getting worse. Remember, Chad is a country that has also taken in a lot of refugees, and they share communities across the border, especially the Masalit and the Zagawa communities. And to the extent that this is happening, it means not only is it going to take away the livelihood, it's also going to take away a potential place for safe refuge. And so the implications are going to be enormous. From a security and economic perspective, of course, Chad is going to be affected because that means it puts an end to the trade that was going on. But it also can lead to some kind of local insurgency within Chad, in part, as mentioned, that they share communities across the border. Now, for Egypt today, as we speak, hosts about 35% of Sudanese refugees. And this, what it might mean is it may actually increase that risk of increased refugees in Egypt, but also the risk of infiltration by the Islamist groups going into Egypt, something that Egypt has been afraid of. And so, by and large, the security and stability of the entire region is actually going to be affected, especially the critical countries of Chad and Egypt, in relation to not just the economics, but the security as well as the humanitarian aspects. At the beginning, I think there was a hope by Sudan armed forces of kind of reintegrating or incorporating RSF back into the mainstream military and state institutions. Increasingly, I think that objective has been abandoned. And right now, the Sudanese armed forces seems to be fighting for state survival as well as legitimacy. On the other hand, the RSF, I think they had ideas of taking over the state institutions, and they now seem to be focused on more consolidating regional areas where they can be able to perhaps bargain for power. Now, what are the prospects for peace? Under the current circumstances, both groups seem to be getting a lot of support, especially externally, in both financial as well as military, in ways that reduces the likelihood of making concessions. And so the incentive to make peace right now is not as high as the incentive to prosecute the war, in the hope that perhaps there's going to be a military solution by either party, which of course is not exactly feasible. And so the prospect for peace is a little bit remote, but it's not completely out of reach yet.
Meanwhile, a landmine blast on Sunday killed 9 people, including 3 children. The victims had been riding in an auto rickshaw along a road in the frontline region of South Kordofan. Sudan's civil war, which began in April 2023, has left mines and unexploded ordnance strewn across the country. However, the explosive could also have dated back to previous rebellions that have shaken South Kordofan state since 2011. Moving on to the Democratic Republic of Congo now, where officials say its land border with Burundi has reopened after being closed for more than 2 months. The Kavimvira border crossing, located on the northern shores of Lake Tanganyika, reopened at 8 a.m. local time. That's according to the governor of South Kivu province. Burundi announced the closure of its border in December after the M23 rebel group captured the border city of Uvira, which lies only 25 kilometers away from its capital, Bujumbura. Now, more than 80,000 people were displaced by the violence and fled to Burundi, according to the UN. Trade, however, continued between the two countries across Lake Tanganyika, which separates the DRC and Burundi. The situation is seen to have improved since January, when the M23 said it had withdrawn from Uvira in response to a U.S. request, which is mediating the conflict between M23 and the Congolese government. Now, according to the UN World Food Programme, life-saving food and nutrition assistance in Somalia could grind to a halt by April. That's unless urgent new funding is secured. An estimated 4.4 million people are facing crisis-level food insecurity, with nearly 1 million experiencing severe hunger. Failed rainy seasons, ongoing conflict and declining humanitarian funding have all compounded the crisis. Somali officials are now appealing for urgent assistance. Mohamed Kahir reports from Mogadishu.
Muhubo Lihle is among millions of Somalis displaced by severe drought ravaging the country. The mother of 7 now lives in an IDP camp about 350 kilometers north of the capital, Mogadishu. She says her family lost everything, their livestock and farmland, forcing them to flee and seek shelter here.
I used to keep livestock and also had a farm, but because of the drought, the animals died and we could no longer farm. We had no choice but to leave our home and come to this camp. Even here, the challenges caused by the drought continue.
As the holy month of Ramadan begins, Muhubo and dozens of other families in this camp say they often have nothing to eat.
I am fasting, but I have nothing to break my fast with. No water, no food. We place our hopes in Allah as we call for help.
Local authorities say limited government resources and humanitarian funding cuts are making it increasingly difficult to respond to the drought emergency.
According to our data, about 1.2 million displaced people in the region are facing food shortages, with over 300,000 children suffering from malnutrition. There is a significant funding gap among humanitarian agencies, making it very difficult to respond effectively to the crisis.
As the number of Somalis affected by the drought continues to rise, officials are intensifying calls for urgent support.
We are appealing to Somalis both inside the country and in the diaspora to take part in efforts to rescue our people facing severe drought. We have established committees, launched fundraising initiatives, and sent appeals to our international partners.
Aid agencies warn that without immediate funding, food assistance programs could be suspended within weeks, leaving millions even more vulnerable. Mohamed Kahir, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Over to South Africa now, where son to former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe has been charged with attempted murder. This follows an incident in which a gardener was shot and injured last week at a mansion Bellarmine Chatunga Mugabe was staying in Johannesburg. Bellarmine Mugabe, together with his co-accused bodyguard, will be appearing in court on Tuesday next week and remains in custody till then. The victim of the Thursday shooting is recuperating in hospital. That's according to South African media reports. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up on the program. A new exhibit explores the legacy of apartheid's spatial planning and its lasting social and economic impact. Welcome back and thank you for staying with us on Africa Live. Now to South Africa, where the legacy of apartheid's spatial planning and its continued impact on the lives of millions of people is currently being explored in a new exhibit in Johannesburg. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela tells us more.
Apartheid in South Africa was a legal system of institutionalized racial segregation, enforcing white supremacy by classifying citizens into racial groups and restricting the rights of non-white residents. It ended in 1994. A new exhibition in Johannesburg called Nkosi Sikelel' Azania traces the system's colonial foundations, its mechanisms of segregation, and its lasting social and economic consequences. The exhibition has a special focus on land, spatial injustice, cultural resistance, and the unfinished business of liberation. And it does this through visual art, archival material, and performance.
So basically, Nkosi Sikelel' Azania, it's taken from two very important references, which is Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, written by Enoch Sentonga. Which it was a hymn. It began as a hymn and later became a liberation anthem. And the word Azania was it was adopted by anti-apartheid activists and Black consciousness movements. So the name Azania symbolized the African ownership of the land, so in amongst activists and in activist usage, the name Azania is often described as the land of Black people or Africa for Africans. So for me, taking Nkosi Sikelel' Africa and Azania and putting them together into Nkosi Sikelel' Azania, it reflects, the exhibition's focus on resilience and resistance, and just like the ongoing pursuit of justice, the ongoing pursuit of land ownership.
Artworks such as Gerald Sekoto's evocative pre-apartheid 3 Men at a Railway Station amplify voices from these works.
Gerald Sekoto, he captured early urban life. He portrayed the struggles and resilience of Black South Africans at a time where such representations were rare in fine art, and he portrayed these topics with such empathy and dignity and humanity, and I mean, one of my favorite pieces by Gerald Sekoto is Two Friends, which is also in the exhibition, and it's basically like it depicts two women walking arm in arm, engaged in conversation. And this painting was painted in 1941. And in 1941, during this time, like South Africa was at war. Life was extremely restricted for Black South Africans. And for him to turn his attention to, the gentle, just like the gentle gestures of connection and friendship, it revealed his ability to find beauty, in everyday life experiences, even under harsh circumstances.
Installations such as Lazima Tebula's To Have a Home is Not a Favor examine the ongoing impact of segregation and South Africa's post-apartheid economy.
So Ulazima Tebula, To Have a Home is Not a Favor, then comes into conversation with those two works in terms of like, it's 2026 and we are still here. So like I said, like it really speaks to the injustices, the injustices of apartheid and how it continues to impact us today in this day and age. We're still very much segregated. We're still very much affected by apartheid in terms of like where we live, who owns the land, who has access to resources, and economic exclusion is still very much a thing.
Pakati also says the exhibition highlights how, despite the end of apartheid in 1994, spatial and economic structures persist in areas of residence, land ownership, and limited access to opportunities. Yodisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Right now it's time to go to Uche for all the latest in business.
Thank you, Mahia. And coming up on Africa Live Biz. Planned illegal action by Ethiopia's bondholders threatens the country's debt restructuring process. And Ghana and Burkina Faso reach agreements to secure trade and border security.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa. So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Well, let's start off in Ethiopia. The country has made significant progress towards restructuring its external debt, and that, of course, is under the G20 Common Framework. But debt restructuring talks with its private Eurobond creditors have hit a roadblock after the country's official creditors rejected a preliminary deal with the bondholders, amid reports of the private lenders warning of possible legal action. Analysts are now cautioning that litigation is not in the best interests of either party. Becca Atoma reports from Addis Ababa.
Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed told lawmakers earlier this month that one of his government's key economic achievements has been its negotiations over the past few years to ease the country's debt burden through restructuring.
Over the past 2 to 3 years, we have been engaged in an intensive struggle to restore Ethiopia's debt to a sustainable framework, and we have succeeded. We have reached an agreement under the G20 Common Framework with nearly all of our creditors, including our Eurobond holders. Debt reprofiling is now underway, and there is no doubt that Ethiopia will move out of a red rating into a mid-level or stronger rating category.
In early January, the government reached an agreement in principle with its private bondholders to restructure Ethiopia's $1 billion Eurobond debt. Reports show that the agreement included a 15% haircut in principal and extended maturity period. However, that deal is now stalled as the country's official creditors committee, chaired by China and France, rejected the agreement, citing comparability of treatment principle. Ethiopia's private Eurobond lenders said that if the stalled restructuring deal cannot be implemented, they reserve all of their rights, including the right to pursue legal action. However, analysts say that litigation is counterproductive and not in the best interest of both parties.
Legal proceedings are very slow, very costly, and I don't think they serve the interest of both of the parties here. I think the official creditors will also focus on convincing these private creditors to agree to some kind of terms. There will be some kind of negotiations, but at the end of the day, legal litigations is gonna take a lot of time, and I don't think that's what they want.
The expert added that without a swift resolution to the Eurobond debt situation, Ethiopia, particularly its private sector, could face serious difficulties in accessing foreign financing.
Even if a creditor from outside agrees to a certain demand from, let's say, Ethiopian Airlines, for instance. Ethiopian Airlines is looking for like $12 billion from outside. They're building a big airport. They need finance from outside. But with this kind of credit rating looming over its aid, it's going to be very much difficult. The interest rates will be very much higher if we are still in default, because those creditors view the country as credit risk. So the risks are high, so they need higher returns.
The Ministry of Finance said Ethiopia will reopen negotiations with its private investors in the hope of reaching a revised agreement. But for now, a deal with private Eurobond lenders remains elusive. Beka Atoma, CGTN, Addis Ababa.
Well, let's move on now. Ghana and Burkina Faso have signed 7 bilateral agreements which are aimed at stabilizing one of West Africa's most sensitive trade and security corridors. Now, these deals were concluded during the latest session of the Permanent Joint Commission for Cooperation, which both sides revived after 6 years of inactivity. Now, officials say the reset builds on earlier high-level engagements between Accra and Ouagadougou in 2023. And according to them, these latest agreements will tighten security, improve regional commerce, and also stabilize frontier communities amid rising threats in the Sahel region. Now, the holy month of Ramadan began last week, a period of deep significance for Muslims across the world. It is a time of prayer, reflection, and sacrifice, but also one of community and celebration. While the spiritual aspect isn't usually a problem, the economic one is in many places. Rising food prices and also inflation are now increasingly reshaping how households mark this very special month. Here's CGTN's Adnan Shaushi with more.
Ramadan is the 9th month of the Muslim year, during which strict fasting is observed from dawn to sunset. Markets across the North African Kingdom of Morocco are busy ahead of iftar, the meal eaten after sunset during Ramadan. But many shoppers say this year's basket costs more. Prices for vegetables and dates have risen by up to 30% compared to a similar period last year. With a biting cost of living crisis, disposable incomes are scarce and far between. Household budgets are reeling.
Every Ramadan, we see noticeable increases in fruit and vegetable prices. Given that Morocco produces much of its own agricultural goods, consumers believe prices should remain aligned with what they can actually afford.
Overall, prices are fairly normal, though some food items have gone up. Merchants deserve to earn fairly, but not in a way that puts additional pressure on families during Ramadan.
Vendors say they too are facing higher costs.
Rising wholesale prices are pushing up retail costs for consumers. However, as demand eases over time, prices should naturally stabilize.
In Tunisia, food inflation remains one of the highest components of the consumer basket. Official figures show double-digit annual increases for fresh produce in recent months. While some traders respect regulated margins, authorities say others attempt to exploit heightened demand.
Teams from the National Food Safety Authority, the Regional Trade Office, police and municipal guards are coordinating efforts to keep prices under control during Ramadan. There is no justification for price increases when food supplies are available and merchants are required to respect regulated profit margins.
Shoppers say visible inspections can make an immediate difference.
I arrived at the market early and noticed prices dropped once authorities showed up. Food prices should remain aligned with consumers' purchasing power year-round, not only when there is oversight.
Despite rising costs, Ramadan remains a month of reflection and solidarity. Across Morocco and Tunisia, families gather to break the fast as community groups and authorities step up support for vulnerable households. Abdel Shawishi, CGTN.
Well, let's go to South Africa now. And Cape Town has announced plans to reclassify properties used primarily for short stays as commercial rather than residential. Now, this move is aimed at streamlining accommodation services while also curbing the surging property prices and restoring long-term rental stock. CGTN's Julie Shire has more.
Platforms like Airbnb and Booking.com stormed onto the South African market just over a decade ago. But demand for more convenient, affordable short-term stays exploded after COVID-19. In tourist hotspots like Cape Town, that spike has driven up property prices and created long-term rental supply challenges.
It's pushing all the prices up, which is causing a link chain throughout the whole of the industry. So where you have a shortage with housing, you've also got very expensive housing, which the average Cape Townian cannot afford.
Cape Town has over 26,000 Airbnb listings, more than cities like Barcelona and New York. The sector contributes significantly to jobs and tourism revenue, but the city is pushing back against those flouting residential property laws.
The proposed draft bylaw does not introduce a new tax or tax hikes, but rather a measure to improve compliance with the city's existing rates policy, which already requires short-term letters to pay commercial rates for properties primarily used for this purpose.
Steadfast Africa runs a portfolio of Airbnb properties across southern Africa and has welcomed stricter regulations, but is concerned about the potential financial impact.
I think that they're trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. The gap, however, between our rates, which are already quite high, and the rates which are being proposed of over double, does seem to be quite a big difference. And I worry that there will be a perverse incentive to not comply with the new regulation.
South Africa is unlikely to ban short-term stays like some other global cities, but it will need to strike a careful balance between local housing needs and tourist demand.
I'd say that the positive impact of having extra beds available and more tourists spending money in a tourist-centric town is usually overwhelmingly more positive than negative. And despite many calls to restrict Airbnb and Booking.com short-let platforms, they've instead tried to seek a way that will perhaps just open more stock available for longer-term lets.
Cape Town's move marks one of the most significant interventions yet in the local housing market. Short-term rental platforms have significantly disrupted the traditional accommodation sector, intensifying calls for a level playing field. Whether the overhaul will curb rising property prices and restore long-term rental stock remains to be seen. Julie Scher, CGTN, Cape Town.
Well, let's turn to international news now. And German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is set to visit China this week in what will be his first since taking office. Now, the two-day visit, starting from Wednesday, will prioritize bilateral trade and investment. Let's take a look at the economic ties between the two nations.
In 2025, China replaced the United States as Germany's largest trading partner, reflecting deep and evolving economic ties. Over the past year, German trade with China reached 253 billion euros, the highest among all EU partners. This strong performance dovetails with major German corporate investments in China. Data shows that German investment in China climbed to around 7 billion euros in 2025, representing a substantial 55.5% increase over the previous year. Among major milestones, 2025 saw BASF's integrated facility in Zhanjiang begin producing core products, a key step in its largest overseas investment project to date. BMW advanced its global renewable strategy with a geothermal heating project in Shenyang, while Volkswagen unveiled a new R&D center in Hefei, its most comprehensive hub outside Germany. Bosch, in August, inaugurated a smart driving innovation project in Suzhou, with plans to invest around 10 billion yuan over the next 5 years. Yet economic interaction flows both ways. China has consistently remained Germany's leading source of imports for 10 consecutive years. In 2024, the port of Hamburg, the largest seaport in Germany, handled an eye-watering 2.2 million TEUs of China-related containers. Meanwhile, Chinese companies remain a top source of investment in Germany, launching 199 foreign direct investment projects in 2024. In 2023, CATL set up its first plant outside China in Thuringia, Germany. The site has now attracted the Fraunhofer Institute, which established its Battery Innovation and Technology Center there. In August 2025, Baidu and Lyft announced a strategic partnership to deploy Baidu Apollo Go's 6th-generation vehicles in Germany as the company's pioneering autonomous solution in the region. During the upcoming German Chancellor's visit to China, a delegation of around 30 senior executives from leading companies will accompany him. With both countries ready to elevate cooperation further, the partnership will continue to adapt and innovate, contributing not only to bilateral growth, but also to broader global economic connectivity.
Well, let's head to the U.S. now, where the Customs and Border Protection Agency is set to stop collecting tariffs, which were imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Now, this announcement comes just days after the Supreme Court declared the duties illegal. In a message to shippers, the CBP now says it will deactivate all tariff codes which are tied to President Donald Trump's earlier orders. It also offered no explanation for the delay in stopping collections at ports, nor any details on potential refunds for importers. And that, of course, is despite estimates that billions in revenue could be eligible for repayment. Now, this move coincides with Trump's rollout of a new 15% global tariff on imports, which were imposed under different legal authority to replace the struck-down ones. Heading to Asia now, economies there are weighing uncertainties following the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling and, of course, President Trump's new tariff moves. China's Commerce Ministry says it is conducting a comprehensive assessment. It also urges the U.S. to lift unilateral tariffs. Now, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region's Treasury Chief calls the U.S. situation a fiasco. Officials in the Republic of Korea say their trade deal with Washington remains valid, but refunds remain uncertain. Now, Japanese government spokesperson says that Tokyo will carefully examine the situation and it will respond appropriately. Meanwhile, India's trade ministry has reportedly delayed sending a negotiation team to Washington this week. And senior officials in Thailand say resetting tariffs to 15% will create a more level playing field for Thai goods. Well, let's move on now. More than 40 million people across the U.S. are currently facing challenges across the 11 states in the northeastern United States are currently facing blizzards. And this comes as the impact of a partial government shutdown creates a confusion there. Now, reports say changes announced to two popular travel programs have made travel more difficult there. Here's Karina Mitchell with more.
Travel in and across the U.S. is potentially turning into a perfect storm as confusion amid the fallout from a partial government shutdown collides with a major blizzard impacting millions of air travelers already facing long lines, delays, and cancellations. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security, also known as DHS, early Sunday announced it was temporarily suspending two popular travel programs, TSA PreCheck and Global Entry. The programs with over 40 million participants permit U.S. residents, citizens, and some foreign citizens to move more quickly through airport security lines. But then an apparent about-face. Multiple reports citing the TSA saying its PreCheck service is currently operational with no change, but will continue to evaluate the situation. The reported reversal comes just hours after DHS Secretary Kristi Noem said in a statement, TSA and CBP are prioritizing the general traveling population at airports and ports of entry and suspending courtesy and special privilege escorts. Going on to add, FEMA will halt non-disaster-related response as well, given the significant impact from a winter storm that will impact parts of the country. The halt would have meant longer waits at airports and as TSA workers remain on the job without pay, while DHS is ensnared in a funding lapse stemming from a political impasse over immigration policy and Democrat calls for more regulation tied to immigration and customs enforcement operations. The confusion comes just as a winter storm barrels into some of the busiest cities in the country, including Boston, Washington, D.C., and New York, which is forecast to get up to 50 centimeters of snow Sunday into Monday, impacting millions of people in the area and creating hazardous travel conditions. FlightAware reports as a result of the storm, thousands of U.S. flights have already been canceled or delayed, with more expected into Monday. Forecasters predict the weather system will create ripple effects across the national air system into next week, exacerbating an already difficult situation for airport workers and travelers. Karina Mitchell, CGTN, New York.
Well, that is all for now in Africa Live Biz. But coming up ahead on Global Business, Rwanda's imports from Kenya dropped significantly over the past year, and that's showing one of the sharpest shifts in regional trade patterns. We'll be exploring the causes of this drop. All of that coming up top of the hour. For now, it is back to Mahia.
All right, Uche, thank you very much. Meanwhile, here's what's coming up in sports. Super South Africa thump co-hosts India in the T20 Cricket World Cup.
When you look at Africa, what do you really see? Do you see fast-growing, endless deserts and parched earth? Or do you see the biggest opportunity?